Well, let's begin with our session today. Today's cliche is God helps those who help themselves. Has anybody heard that before?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Often heard. Has anybody used it?
Oh, yes.
So that's also, it's been proclaimed. It also, I mean, we'll go into some of the things that are true about this statement, but we're also, it could mean by if you say it in some ways, people could interpret it this way: God doesn't help those who don't help themselves.
You know, I think ours are different.
I'm just saying it can be heard that way. So I'm not saying that's what you meant. I'm just saying that some people could hear it that way, and that's so that's it's also known as, it's AKA. And Sentis, how are you? Let's begin with this song. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth.
No, I'm okay. It's Nina. I'm sorry, I need a service.
There's some handouts right over there on that table.
Handouts.
So where does this cliche come from? What is the origin of this saying? It is, by the way, not a biblical saying. It does not appear in the Bible. So even though it has the word God in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is derived from the Bible. It actually starts before the Bible, or before Jesus, in Greek philosophy, as an idea of thought. And there's, so you would go to, you have a god that you wanted to go visit. You needed something from a god of the Greeks, and then you would go to their site, and you would have to do some work in order to get, you had to do something in order to get their help, their gifts from those gods. So that was kind of there was a transactional quality to Greek philosophy and the Greek gods, and that's how the people who were running those Greek god sites, that's how they made a living, was the transaction that took place there. This became part of, I think, our culture, at least in the United States culture, with Ben Franklin, the Poor Richard's Almanac. This was the quote that was in it. It goes into the kind of idea that America is about, which is, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you can do everything. It's that dream that America is all about. If you work hard enough, then you will, at the end of the day, you will have success. You'll have the things that you're aiming for. Your dreams will be realized. That is part of our culture, and so it's kind of ingrained in who we are. And that's why we kind of go back to a God. We would love to have a God who could help those people who help themselves, because we believe we're the ones that help ourselves. We want to be in that category. Now, as all cliches all have truth in them. So there is truth in this. For instance, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. There you have a big test coming up. You are a student or a professional, and you have a test coming up. And if you pray and you don't do anything, you're not going to do well. Unless you have some kind of other gift, or you have the key. You have to put effort in, otherwise the test result will not come out satisfactorily. You've done a lot of work prior to that. You have gained some knowledge. You've had to put some effort into it. It's not just based on God providing you the answers to the questions. The same is true for looking for a job. If you say, I really want a new job, this job is terrible. I'm not saying that, by the way. But if you're saying that and you say, please God, give me a job, and you don't do anything, like maybe go look for a job, maybe prepare your resume, you aren't going to get a job, most likely. So these are the different kinds of things that you would say, okay, well, this is true. You have to actually do something if you're going to receive the things that you're praying for in this, if you were praying for these items. I've given you a couple of examples, but it could apply to many more examples like that. Paul wrote, and I think this is on it's the first one on here. This passage can be interpreted to be it says this cliche is actually true. Okay. For 2 Thessalonians, he's talking to the people in Thessalonica. He says, "For even when we were with you, we gave you this command. Anyone unwilling to work should not eat. For we hear that some of you are living irresponsibly, mere busybodies, not doing any work. Now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living." So he's giving them instructions on how they're supposed to live. And he's saying, you can't just expect to live off of the group. You've actually got to do something work-wise to help the team, to help the community. And so there was, obviously we don't know what the issue was in Thessalonica, but obviously there were some people who were like, God's helping me and I don't have to do anything. Yes, Jennifer?
Or they're like told that they inherited this, it's like, oh, I inherited this land, so it's mine, I own it by divine right, and so they feel very entitled to not have to work. And there's that sense.
Yeah, so I don't know what exactly in Thessalonica, what was going on, because we don't have their letter, but Paul is responding to their issue, and he's saying, don't sit on the sideline, you've got to do something. And that is actually part of what we do in churches. We can't say, oh, well, I just want to gain things from the church. There's a part of church that is about contributing something to the community. You have to continue to give as to make the church stronger. And so that's what Paul is saying. And you could say, oh, well, this cliche is God helps those who help themselves. Yes, if you are helping, if you're doing something, then yes, God will help you, will give you something in return. So these are ways that it's actually, that the cliche has that little bit of truth in it that makes us want to accept it as the only answer here, or what we might want to say to somebody else. But based on these two examples, or the examples that I've given, you might think that the cliche passes the sniff test. But I have two things to say. First, I don't believe that God maneuvers our test scores in the test opinion or our job options. My general feeling is that we pray about these things, we say our prayers to God, and that is helping us to better understand where God is leading us at a specific time, where God is calling us to be. When opportunities intersect with our prayers, that is what we might call the Holy Spirit, but God is not doing the puppeteering up there to make the things move like that. We've got to be aware of things, and our prayers help us to be more aware, to be open to those opportunities. And when those things click into place, that's the Holy Spirit in action. That's God, God's being happening around us. So that's one thing. The second part of that, and the thing that makes us question this, is when I need God's love and help the most is when I can't help myself. Now, that could be a variety of reasons that that's true. Maybe it's just the situation around me is overwhelming. There's too many tragedies happening in one moment, whether it's global tragedies or personal tragedies. Sometimes it's too much. And we need a connection with God, and we can't help ourselves. We don't have the wherewithal to do it. Maybe we don't have the skills to do it. We just don't have the gifts and talents to do it. And that's reasonable for everybody. There will be times when we don't have the skills and talents, and we're going to have to rely on God. We'll talk about what that means in a second. And then maybe it is that we have been working hard at digging a hole for ourselves for a long period of time, and the hole is very deep, and it keeps getting deeper, and we don't know how to get out of it. Now I'm imagining, I see heads shaking, so I'm guessing that all of you at some point in your life have experienced something where you have needed assistance, and no matter what you did, what you could do, what you were capable of doing, you were unable to figure out how to get out of the hole or through the situation, and you needed help that you couldn't do on your own. Now, in our culture, we try to hide those moments. We don't want to admit that it could possibly happen to us, but it does. Now, I'm going to tell you that I've been watching, thanks to my wife, who chooses shows. We have this running commentary. She chooses shows to watch that are generally not happy at the end of every episode. I'm just going to say that straight up. But there is something on, I believe it's on Netflix right now, and it's called Made. Has anybody watched it? Now, we're not through it yet, but I can tell you that every episode, you're kind of going along, and then something happens, and you're just pulling your hair out for how frustrated you are for the main character in this, the maid in this particular story. Things just don't. She just doesn't have the abilities personally. She doesn't have the support structure in her life. Her family structure is not there. She's in an abusive relationship with some. She has a child who the father of the child is abusive, and she's trying to figure out the system. And every episode, we just watched an episode last night, and Jennifer said, "Oh, there's only 11 minutes left," and I said, "Well, something tragic's going to happen." And I was right. And that's kind of, there are times, thankfully, I get frustrated and we talk about it after every episode. I'm like, why doesn't she do this? And why doesn't she do that? And why doesn't she do this? And then we want her to be able to learn the skills that she could use to survive the situations that she's in. But she doesn't do that. And the reality is that's true for a lot of people in our world. They are just bouncing back and forth through our governmental systems. They're bouncing through relationships. They're struggling to make ends meet financially. They have all of these pieces in their life. And me as a viewer of the show want to solve things. And sometimes it's beyond being solved. She also makes some bad choices. So the cliche kind of leads to the point where God doesn't help those who don't help themselves. That is the inverse of the cliche as it's written. The problem for me with this cliche is that it can and is used in ways to avoid helping people. If we're Christians, as we've heard in previous cliches and in our lessons actually in the last couple of weeks, we've heard about what we need to do when our neighbors are in trouble. We need to, in today's gospel lesson, we heard, even though you want to be resting and you're done with your things, you actually have to respond when somebody's seeking help. We have responsibility here, and the cliche can say, oh, well, if you're not helping yourself, then you don't deserve help from God. That is the way the cliche could potentially be heard. I'm not saying that anybody means it when they say that, but a hearer of that cliche could interpret it that way. And that, as a Christian, is not good. There are passages of scripture, and they're on your sheet of paper that are handed out. If you don't have one, it's over on the table. And I'm just going to go through these relatively quickly. I think they are self-explanatory. This one is from Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the alien. I am the Lord your God. That is a commandment. It's not one of the 10 commandments, but it's one of the commandments in the Old Testament. This is saying that you should allow things, some of the things that you think are yours, you should actually give them to somebody else. Portions of this, in this case, it's a farmer, so it's an agricultural economy. The outskirts of your field, leave them to be picked by the people who come by, who are in need of food. Let those hang out there. We can bring it into our economy, and how do we take the excess of our things, really even the great benefits of our things, and remember that it's not only for us, it's for a greater good.
There are restaurants in this, at least there have been, who give away their unsold food to the city harvest or whatever, and any of the city.
Lots of bakeries do that, and they once their baked goods are a day old, they say, well, I can't sell these as my product, but I can give them to people who can eat them.
I mean, they're still perfectly edible. They
Of
just-
course, yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same general theme there, is that you don't waste the food. You want to make sure that it's eaten, but this is even going further than that. It's not even saying that you picked it, it's just saying just leave it there. Just let it go. It's not yours. Don't even put it into your silos, just let it be picked by other people. Here's from James. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. That is pointing to our responsibility to care for people who are outside of the people who might be able to help themselves. In this case, it's talking of, not that all orphans and widows are helpless, but they, in this particular economy and in this culture that James is writing to, they were the people who were very marginalized in the world. People who had very little opportunity. And there was no government help for that, and no Social Security, and none of that kind of stuff. But we still have a need to look for the people that are in our world that need our help. The next one is a longer one. It's one of Jesus' parables, and it's from Matthew. And it says this: when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom and prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." Heard that one? So this is my, and we're going to open up a conversation here, but I have never seen in my life clothing coming out of the heavens and dropping to the ground. Food dropping out and prepared and given, passing off to other people. What I have seen is I have seen people from their heart giving of their clothing, or giving of their food, or giving of their provisions, giving people items that they need. I've seen that. God is working through all of us. And the challenge of this cliche is that we need to remember that there is something called grace. It's a theological term. It's also a given name to some people. Grace is something that is undeserved. We've done nothing for it. It doesn't have to be given to us. So there's no transaction that's involved in it. Grace is something that God promises us and is biblical. All of the things that we are given are from God. And remembering that, if remembering the idea of grace says that we're undeserving of things and there's no thing that we can do helping ourselves, God doesn't just help those who don't help themselves. God doesn't help those who help themselves only. God helps all people. And God's work is only done by the people of God taking that love and spreading it out, acknowledging that there are people in need. So the cliche comes a little short for me. I don't think people mean it the way that they say it. But if you are hearing it, if you're an outsider and you're hearing it for the first time, it could discourage you from being a faithful person. God gives to all people. Now there's a Benedictine way, a philosophy. It's ora et labora. It means pray and work. We do have responsibilities to do things. But don't expect that God is only going to help you if you do those things. That's where the indulgences worked out. If you have your Catholic history going on. Oh, but if you have enough cash, you can get through this. You have enough land, you can get through this. You can do whatever you want. That's not the way God works. That's not the biblical understanding of life. The world is that God gives us when we don't deserve things, or when we haven't done anything to earn it. Now, I've done a lot of talking. What are your thoughts on this? How does it impact your life? Jennifer?
Well, a lot of people, when I was seeing patients in the DC area, you see anyone from people in the southeast that don't have running water in their house, and then you go to people who live in the Watergate, had everything in the world. There is that mentality of people, they're like, well, anybody, people in the Watergate are like, well, anyone can do this. I didn't grow up rich. It's like, well, you didn't grow up generally without running water in your house. You didn't grow up with a lot of, social structure issues that were working against you, social policies and mentalities that were working against you. And it's like, no one starts on a level ground. In life, some people just have some inborn disadvantages for whatever reason. And that mentality of God helps those who help themselves, it doesn't work for you. I think it gives people that sense of control in their lives. So when they're working and they're like, well, I'm just gonna, find a way and do it. And a lot of people have gotten through life doing that. But when you're, facing the end of life, you can't help yourself. There's nothing you can do. It's completely out of your control, and that doesn't work for you. You do have to depend on the help of others. There's no control over that situation generally. That's my thoughts.
It makes me think too about Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, or the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. That somehow the people who are aware of their need, whether it's financial, social, some illness, often have a far deeper sense of God's grace because they never thought of themselves as self-made men or women. They've been maybe hanging in, by the skin of their teeth or living on the margins, but there's a kind of a depth of receptivity that people who assume that they're sort of in control of their lives until they're not, because in the end none of us are, but that live by, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be acting and and making decisions, but I think there's a capacity for receiving grace that's very, very deep in the people who know they need it. So there is some sense of being blessed in knowing that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is humans generally aim to be in control,
Yeah.
but we're not always in control. And we've got to learn that. It's a learned behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
think there's a little connection to Jen's homily. I'm trying to remember the exact expression. Did you talk about boundless or unboundless hospitality?
Radical hospitality.
Radical hospitality, which is kind of an interesting concept or idea, and particularly in this age that we find ourselves in. And, you know, I could go down the political avenue right now where I, you know, again, in a previous talk, you know, we talked about, you know, trying to help others, and sometimes, you know, it is just easy to be selfish, and, you know, I can only take care of myself. I can only control what I am doing or thinking, and, you know, can't necessarily change other people. And again, with what you're saying, you know, thinking of empathy, just, you know, boundless empathy, you know, that hopefully leads to action as well, but don't know.
Yeah. So, you know, this kind of the radical hospitality idea being that you have to go out of your way to go find people and welcome them, rather than just waiting for them to come to you, which is, that's
But
the way I kind of
sometimes what you
interpret it.
have to offer, sometimes, you know, everyone's, you know, you've had people in your life who, no matter what you try to do, financially, physically, whatever, what it is you have to give, you know, it's neglected or it's not needed, but then to have the capacity to continue to love, I think is like the real grace.
And that continuing love, or that opportunity to give, is what God is calling us to do and be, which will help us fulfill God's mission for the world that we live in.
And it's difficult, I think, when you have someone in your life that doesn't take action. And, for example, I have a son who has type 1 diabetes, and he doesn't really take care of himself as he could to the maximum amount that would be. And watching this, you can see, you know, disaster ahead of really terrible consequences. And so, and when you try to help, you know, say, you know, you gotta do this, and they don't, they say if you tell them that, it makes it worse.
It's like the reminders that you.
Well, yeah, like, you know, why don't you do this and do, you know, take your insulin and eat better, and, you know, and they say that when you say those things, it makes it worse. That person feels like it's hopeless. So all you do is pray, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
Since
I
you're
think-
not helping yourself, but you're hoping that God will bring awareness to this, to your son, for example. What do you?
I mean, I'm being a type 1 diabetic, I kind of know all about this, but I
didn't know you had.
I am a type 1 diabetic, but I for 30 years.
Wow.
But it's I remember as a young type 1 diabetic, when people, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that, and it's like, this was 20-year-old.
Right.
I was like, I've lost control of my life, and I don't want to lose control of my life. It takes some maturity to realize that there are things that you can do to make yourself feel better, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And that is, you know, I'm thankful for people being nagging me, for lack of a better word. I was relatively mature at a relatively young age, but there were things that I was like, oh yeah, I forget this and I forget that, and that's normal. And so just figuring out how to love somebody in a way that you know, that they will know. I think it's a lot of times when you're loving somebody and they're frustrated with your love, which does happen from time to time, that as they look back on it, they will say, you know what, that was what I needed to hear, and I wasn't open to it at the time, but that doesn't mean it wasn't loving.
Mhm.
Yes, Dave?
Sort of connecting the last two, thinking about radical, and I've been thinking about this word for a while, and it's as opposed to just like, giving the person, donating to this thing, well, maybe that isn't what they need, maybe it's something more outside of the box. Meet them where they are, whatever, I think of radical, it's like, it's really just out there and just doing the work, and sometimes radical is just like, maybe in the case of the kid is just like taking a step back and saying, okay, well, you know all these things, and I'll be here if you need me, but give them the sense of control, or like really thinking outside the box and trying to meet them where they are, and sometimes that is just taking a step back, or being in a different spot at a different time, and like taking the time to think in their own mindset.
Mhm. Yeah, so sometimes the love that you're sharing requires you to step back from the conflict that is ensuing, and that can still be love through your prayers and your and it's you kind of said, okay, know that I'm here for you, but right now this is where you are, and you make these choices on your own, and that is saying, sometimes that's where grace intersects with this, in the sense that that's where we have to have faith that God's going to go into those spaces and help out. Yes.
Sometimes when you offer something, the other person doesn't want to accept it because they are afraid of being in debt to you. And they don't see it as something they could accept and then maybe pass forward at some point. But they're very uncomfortable because they feel indebted.
And certainly in our culture,
Oh, yes.
being indebted to somebody is a big deal, and we shy away from it.
Yeah.
And Jesus is trying to tell us that we all need each other. That's his basic teaching throughout the gospel, is that we can't do this alone, and we shouldn't feel indebted. We should just, that's kind of the radical hospitality piece of this, the grace piece of this, is that no matter what we've given you as a group, our expectations of you repaying it are whatever. We don't have you can't put a dollar value on it. You can't put an activity behind it. You just have to know that we've given it to you freely. And that's what Christian ethic is about. Our country is not really based on that, as much as we think that we are. Our country is based on this kind of, everybody's an individual, rather than everybody is connected through a fiber of community.
We had a wonderful priest here for a while, Cody Underser, and he used to talk about reckless loving. Just don't worry about it. Just give it out, and there's no transaction. It's just you love.
And that's Jesus. That's the Christian way. We struggle with that,
Yes,
and
we
because
do.
we love to count and we love to keep the ledger going.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for us to escape that, even though it's like, oh yes, I understand that intellectually. It's hard for us to give it up because it's been ingrained in who we are.
I
Jen, and then Steve.
find it talking about like reckless love and radical hospitality, and that's your MO. And perhaps someone that you really love that's not their MO, maybe they're a little selfish. And then I find it hard to then feel that reckless love for them in their selfishness and extend to them empathy. And that's where I think being a Christian gets hard, and acting in those things gets hard, because why are you all about yourself? Like, why aren't you about everyone else? And that can be a very frustrating feeling.
Yeah, so, yeah, it is, I mean, it's fair, it's, when you're attempting to help somebody and they can't see that, and then you get frustrated with their inability to be open to your help or helping other people, or seeing the bigger picture of how the community is connected to one another, networked. That's why we're all in a work in progress. And I would contend that there are moments in our life when we're on both sides of that. And that's in coming to realize that, maybe I was like that in this particular situation, I'm like this, and I'm over here, I'm in a different situation. And realizing that we kind of dip back and forth depending on the relationships that we're engaging in. Yeah.
Sort of thinking about the people getting stuck with the transactionalness of things and sort of the radical meeting people where they are. I remember hearing a story about two families that lived in an apartment building. One was significantly more poor than another one, where the sort of better off family would occasionally give them some food or give them some clothes and things. And then the mother said, you know what, to their child, can you go over to their house and ask them for a cup of sugar? And so it's like, well, we have sugar, yes, but they want to feel like they are, it's a reciprocating relationship, and that we're caring about each other, and we're supporting each other, and we're not just constantly throwing things at them and they're in debt to us. And so it's like you sort of meet them where they are and sort of allow them to be a part of the relationship rather than like you throwing them stuff.
So I hear in that particular story, I hear you have to understand the culture that we live in.
Yeah.
And no matter if we like, we want to change that, that's nearly impossible to change. Any individual person, it's going to take generations to change culture. So we have to be wary of it when we're interacting with people, and that's being, having the empathy to understand that people do feel like they, owe you something, even though you have told them, 1,000 times that they don't owe you something, and so you try to figure out a way to allow them to live into that.
There's a phrase that sounds so pejorative because people don't understand what it means. When I grew up, we heard about the Indian giving, that you're giving something and taking it back, and that's exactly not what it means at all. Because actually, in tribal cultures, the goods circulate around the tribe, and it's an act of community building and care. So, I'm celebrating a birthday, I'm gonna give you a blanket, and then, the person has something else to celebrate and is gonna give that blanket away, and it all keeps circling around. So everyone.
It's like regifting.
It's regifting, yeah, but it's not transactional, it's not, I give you this, you give me that, and it's really quite a beautiful concept, and.
It's like you paying it for constantly
Yeah.
paying something forward.
Yeah, and so it's really incredibly generous and connected in a way that, our culture is not. I do this for you, you do this for me, and that's sort of the way it works. It's not the Christian way, but it's the way we live.
How are you feeling about God helps those who help themselves? From when you started, when we first came in here and to now. Any new insights from today?
I think you can also use it in a very snarky way, You kind of push ahead and you get impatient and you act.
You could use it as snark.
Yeah.
But to piggyback on what you were talking about, in Native American culture, there wasn't a concept of ownership.
Right.
And I'm thinking of
Yeah.
Peter Minuit, the first Dutch governor of Manhattan. Well, we're going to give the Sionois some beads and some trinkets, and now we own Manhattan. But again, in Native American culture, it's communal. There's no transaction.
Their economy didn't work the same way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One more session next week, and then we'll move to August class, and we'll figure out what we're gonna do then.